What's up, guys? Merry Christmas. It is Christmas Day as of this recording and posting, going up the same day. Does not always happen. And I wanted to talk today about just some basic kind of translation terms. I've been seeing some people in some of the WoW streams I've been in some of the Twitch streams I've been in the comments section here and over on Work to Game. As well as kind of even in our streams, which Brian and I will be live tonight. We've been streaming pretty much every weekday. We usually stream at 8 a.m. for Christmas Day. Should you guys see this go live, it'll be an evening stream. But otherwise, we're live 8 a.m. over at Work to Game with the number 2. And it's this concept of kind of basic terminology. There's some questions that came up in some of the world first races around just some concepts that I think many of us that think about MMOs and have been playing MMOs as at least part of the games we play, if not a primary part of the games we play for years on end. It doesn't take very many months for it to feel like it can be, years of knowledge that just kind of gets downloaded. And if you've been playing for decades, it's just concept after concept that's been iterated on. And there's some basic terms that get thrown out that are just incredibly important as introductory terms to your first MMO. So first of all, to anybody that is watching this and is just starting, has just started, has recently started, or is thinking of starting their first MMO, welcome to possibly some of the largest, most open sandbox experiences you can have in a place where there are other people, in a place where a huge aspect of the community that you're joining is actually the community itself. It's not built by the devs. The devs do have an impact on it, but the community itself can create all sorts of texture and tone on a game that really, surprisingly, devs have very little control over, and can really add or subtract to the community that you're choosing to join into. The first is, how do you play games like this? Well, you're going to start out and you're going to create a character. On games like Final Fantasy XIV, you're going to be creating predominantly a single character, which is going to have multiple ways to play it encased in that one person. On games more like World of Warcraft, these are the two primary MMOs that I talk about here, you're going to see where each character chooses its own class, and they may all be different races. Most games have both male and female characters and can range in what you can control from height to build, or maybe it just kind of defaults it. It can really range, and the reason for these limitations is because of all of the gear and cosmetic choices that they make available and continue to add, because these are by their very nature service games. These are games that you don't buy a fixed amount of content. You buy in with the goal of investing hundreds of hours, hundreds of days of playtime into this account, into this place. And the whole benefit is that you're building something. And so you want to know that you're buying into an MMO that isn't going anywhere. It's one of the things that makes things like the gap between Destiny 1 and Destiny 2 so frustrating for Destiny players, because you do lose everything. And when you want to reset, usually you have to be iterative in process, which means that any decision you made in the past, you have to build on, whether that decision is now a good one or a bad one. You see it as a limitation in long-running games like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy, where they want to make a change to games that are more newer with the times. They've learned how to do an aspect of combat or questing or storytelling better, but they have to do it in a way that is possible by every class they've chosen to ever introduce into the game. Any class they choose to add, any race they choose to add, they have to decide how will that interact with items that may have been added a decade ago or more. And so you're buying in for that long service, and that has both pros and cons to these games, but is part of the draw, that you're going to build something, and every hour you put in is an hour you keep, as opposed to something like playing through, God of War or something like that, where each game you hit a hard reset at the end. And so choosing to grind to something that is purely cosmetic can feel a little wasted, because by the time you get it, you might be ready to put that game down, and then it's all for nothing, as opposed to carrying that cosmetic forward through content that you have yet to see. So once you create this character, you're going to log in, and they're going to need to teach you how to play. Games can do this very differently, but most often it's done through a traditional RPG, because that's where these came from in that D&D roots. They're going to push you through a leveling process, and that leveling process is going to establish narrative, it's going to introduce gameplay elements, it's going to slowly introduce the ability to play with others, and they're going to build all of those features in. Is there a crafting system? Do you need to know how to interact with it? Is there an auction house market board type system? Do you need to know how to interact with that? How does a quest work? And all of this, but it's going to result in a capped level. At some point, you are going to hit a point that is effectively the max level. There may be leveling or experience that takes place beyond that, that is cosmetic or kind of adds on it. ESO kind of does this in a weird way, where once you get to that point, there may be a continued progression. Think about like Diablo Paragon levels, if you've ever played that game, where after that, you kind of continue to pile stats in. But once you hit that point, once you climb to the top of that mountain, there's this plateau. And on that plateau, at that peak, there is a whole world of content. And in many times when these more established games, that can feel like the game almost where it really starts. And so depending on how hard it is to get to max level, it can feel like a fraction of the game is in the leveling content and a fraction of the game is in the end game content. And to players that have been in the end game for a long time, whether that fraction is the bigger or smaller half, it feels like the bigger half. And it is where things get the focus. It's where you see Twitch streams, it's where you see YouTube videos, it is where you see everything, but it is not what you're going to experience as a new player. You're going to be over here in leveling content, and games handle that difference, that dichotomy there, to varying levels of strength. Final Fantasy does a great job of establishing a narrative. You basically play through a full single-player RPG worth of story each and every expansion. That's a promise, whether you want it or not. It's required content. You can only skip so much of it, and that's what they give. And so you have to play through these in order. Imagine a new Star Wars movie gets announced. You have to start at episode 1 and play them in order, regardless of the quality of those movies, before you are allowed to view the current movie. That is their plan, and that way, the benefit of that is they can tell these really complex stories at the end, where you have these characters that you've been following through season after season, effectively, of these 2-year expansions, and each expansion comes out at an initial launch, which has 40 or 50 hours worth of story, and then we get updated little short sections to those story, 5, maybe 10 hours worth of content, a couple of times throughout the expansion, where we'll have patch 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then we'll start over. World of Warcraft is less narrative based, and you actually are more gameplay focused. So you go through basically an opening gameplay tutorial in a trapped zone, and at the end of that zone, they are going to teach you things about how you play. The general idea, you're going to see this type of animal, you're going to see this type of animal. These are the themes of combat to expect, and these are the themes of the types of stories we're going to tell, and then they're going to launch you into the previous expansion just so you can kind of catch the previously on. You're going to be mostly lost, and then they're going to dump you into the current expansion where you're going to be pushed through a required story, and at the end of that, they allow you to go back on alternate characters, since you level each character for each class, each of the many classes. If you choose to level alternates, you can go level those through the other expansions and kind of go back and say, you know what, I have a lot of interest in that, let me go see that content. And in both cases, that content may have been best in class at its time, but you may be playing an expansion that is 2, 4, 6, 10 years old, and that content may have aged nice and it may have not. And so it can feel very different, and it's interesting that you can go back and still partake. Things like Destiny actually vault that, and they're moving to a system where they kind of limit how you interact with that, and they're kind of playing with the fabric. PSO2 Genesis will actually drive a hard wall between them, but not in a way that sections it off like Destiny 1 and 2, where it literally splits into two separate games, but actually just a wall that you can kind of port over, and you can play it as it was, or you can play it now. Some games choose to leave those as two separately running franchises. Final Fantasy, when we talk about Final Fantasy, we're typically talking about Final Fantasy XIV Online, because that's the new one. But Final Fantasy XI is still very, very alive, and still will actively take your money and give you game in trade as an ongoing service. That is still a thing that is offered. Some of these games move to also being supported by private server communities, which is not just to skirt the cost, but is usually because they want a form of the game that the developer has not found a way or a desire to put forward. That's how we got WoW Classic. WoW shut down some private servers, said it was impossible to run it. The private community had done it, and then they said, you guys don't really want this, and the community pushed back long enough and hard enough that they said, okay, maybe you do. They gave it to the community responded, overwhelmingly with liking the content, which will now mean that we'll probably get the next expansion of WoW brought back in a classic reboot type format. And so as you level these characters, you're going to get introduced to a ton of concepts of gameplay, but predominantly in these games, you are leveling through old content, which means even if you're in group content, they've either found an incentive for other players to come back and group with you, or you're grouping with other new players, and you're doing it rarely. You're mostly going through questing. Questing is going to be where you just talk to an NPC, and then it asks you to do one of a couple traditional things. You're going to be asked to go get an item, so you're either going to go deliver something or go fetch it and come back. Maybe that item is simply going and getting information. You're going to be asked to go kill something for the purpose of just slaying it and moving on. You're going to be asked to go get something that involves killing and either looting a chest next to it or killing it and picking something up off their body. And with that, you may find that you have to go kill 10 spiders to find 10 eyes, even though we all know that spiders have more than one eye. And when you kill a big spider and you fight to the death and it has no eyes on it, don't know what to tell you. And so that's just the nature of it. Now, these games have gotten better over the years, and there's a variety of other type quests that they'll toss in there as spice, but that's kind of your core. Occasionally, there's an escort quest. Those can take a long time because you actually walk next to an NPC that has to walk at a pace, usually to account for the fact that you might have to kill things along the way. They're usually talking to you. They're stopping at predetermined checkpoints to kind of start encounters, and they account for players that maybe aren't as adept as you at following. So they go at the pace they go. They kind of can role play walk, if you will, where they actually walk very, very slowly. So you go through this process, and it really doesn't teach you how group play works. So when you get to level cap, you may still have a lot of questions. Group play in these games centers on 3 traditional roles. The first is tank. Tanks are going to be the ones that take the hits. They're going to make everything really mad at them by generating hate. They make things hate them. That can be called enmity, threat. It's called a number of things, but the idea is that they're going to make everything face them, and then they're going to be packed in big ol' armor, or they're going to have magic shields or physical shields, and they're going to be equipped with what's called defensive cooldowns, abilities where on a cooldown, on an amount of time for something to kind of cool off before you can use it again, maybe a recast timer or something like that, they're going to be able to use this ability, and they're going to be able to trigger it to up their defensive capabilities to take these hits. And so their rotations are going to be making things mad and then protecting themselves for the incoming barrage of hits from either one big guy or many, many little guys or some mix in between. The next is going to be your healer. Your healer is going to actually heal all that damage that the tank inevitably takes, or any damage that anybody in your group takes. And if they fail, you die. They may have an ability to resurrect in combat, they may not, depends on the game how that is treated, and their whole job is to keep you guys healed. Now in various games that does create downtime in certain types of content where they may have an ability to put off some form of attack or something like that to kind of assist moving things along with the last group who decides how long does it take to deal with it, right? We've got a guy taking the hits, maybe putting a little bit out with a sword or an axe or a hammer or whatever, and then we've got him getting healed. But really, both those groups have a primary task that doesn't allow them to be solely offensive. And so you end up with DPS, damage per second, your damage dealers. Actually, DPS is what refers to how much damage they put out per second, and that is so synonymous with their job that they're actually referred to as DPS. They are there to do the damage, and they will either be doing single target damage or multi-target damage that affects an entire area, that AoE, and that is going to be their primary task. They can be ranged, they can be up close, they can be a mix of both. They're typically in either ranged or both, and in some games like Final Fantasy, ranged is actually split into physical damage versus magic damage. But they're all performing the same task, and because we have to balance group content, at least at a casual level, for any mix of those to come along, all of the tanks will have certain things in common. All of the healers will have a similar set of end results, right? They'll all be able to heal you, but they might get there through, I put up a lot of minor heals and big shields, or I do a lot of what's called heal over time, HOTS, and they're going to kind of slowly tick up, and so I'm going to have to put those on, and then just kind of layer those on, and it's going to take a while to heal you to full, but you'll get there. Or they may be what's kind of referred to as a flash healer, where there's this bright flash in the pan, and it heals you up very rapidly, but that changes from more of like, proactive to reactive healing, and a mix of those healers in larger group content can actually layer on top of each other to kind of make up for the weaknesses that each of those types of healing may do. Damage dealers have the same mix. You may have different classes that can actually buff other classes, make them stronger. And so you may have classes that kind of work well next to each other, where one may do less damage than the average of it, but they may actually increase those around them by so much that they provide a utility to it. They provide a tool that is necessary that makes everybody else stronger, either for all the time or for very short bursts of time, because as we get into group content, it can start by we're just out in the world doing bigger, badder quests together, and it can actually move into dungeons where you're going in and you're killing a specified number of encounters back to back, and then it ends. And in Final Fantasy, that's 4-man. In Destiny, that's 3-man. And WoW, that's 5-man. It can range the numbers. It's usually 1 tank, 1 healer, and some DPS. Most of these games don't support a utility class. It does happen on occasion in an MMO, but you have to keep in mind, like, it's easiest to balance across those core 3, so that's what most games do. From there, we move into larger content. As we move closer and closer to endgame, 4 and 5-man is hard to present an optimal challenge. It puts a lot of individual soul responsibility, and you can only rely so much. A tank can only get so hard before you'd be killing the tank in 1 hit. So what if we had 2 tanks? What if we moved to a party so big that you could have 2 tanks? Well, then you can have mechanics that require that those tanks take turns, and then you can have multiple healers, and you can have a lot of damage dealers. And so you move into groups that can be anywhere from 8-mans in Final Fantasy to 24-mans in Final Fantasy, all the way up to 25-mans, and historically we went all the way up to 40-mans in WoW. And then for specific type events, you can have open world things where it's just a horde of players. In Final Fantasy, there's an event coming online probably sometime in January where it's going to be required that 48 people work together. And so the larger this gets, the harder it is to coordinate, but the less soul responsibility, and it can just be exciting to be around that many other people. And the way you decide how much damage you do is not just the class you play, but it's the gear you equip. And so the gear is what you focus on, especially once you've hit the end or the soft end, there may be something after it, of that experience curve. Once you've reached the max level or the level cap, then you would actually start going and chasing gear. And gear will have an item level associated with it that will help you kind of, at a glance, tell which gear might be better than other gear. That's referred to as eye level, and you're going to focus on pushing the eye level of your character up as much as possible. And you do that by going against harder and harder content. It's usually kind of formed as a pyramid. At the lowest level, a fresh character, pretty much anything you do will grant you better gear than what you had from leveling. Your leveling gear was really maybe good for the level it was, but it's not as good as what you can get now. And so there's a base item level that's pretty much just handed out. It may even be sold from vendors or non-player characters, NPCs, and it may be just distributed almost for free. And once you move beyond that, you may have to start actually kind of engaging in content a little bit intentionally. That might be player versus player, PvP. That might be player versus environment, PvE, like those dungeons or those raids that I just discussed. But you're going to work through that, and you're going to start by clearing them at a pretty casual difficulty. This is sometimes referred to as normal. Sometimes there's actually something below normal. Like in World of Warcraft, they have a raid that is below the normal raid called Looking for Raid, and it's meant to be something that you can just hop in, get a feel for it, get a feel for the story, but it's very, very, very forgiving. And that's going to get you up to kind of the lowest item level of that casual content. That may have a range to it that's pretty healthy. It may be pretty narrow. Depends on the game. In some games, you can actually have multiple items at or around the same item level, and you may have to look at the stats on them to decide which one's really better for what you need, because you may prioritize certain stats. That stat priority, that preference, may be kind of your class. In Final Fantasy, I play a class that's called Warrior, and I have the ability to control when I'm going to do a critical hit or do bonus damage. And so putting critical hit, which increases my percentage chance at critical damage, isn't really as important to me as another stat is, possibly, because I'm already part of the time in 100% control of my critical damage. And so if I have a 100% chance to crit, then anything I'm putting on my gear that increases my percent chance doesn't really do as much for me. Now that gear may have another thing to it. In that game, for example, critical hit, it not only increases the chance of critical hit, but increases the amount of damage on critical hits. And so that's helpful. But if you think about how that's valued from an item level standpoint, you're kind of paying for both halves. And because I'm only partially using one half, I'm not getting as much out of it as I am about around another stat. I also may, because I play as a tank, may prefer some defensive. I may feel that, you know what, my job is really to survive, and I may need to stack a little bit of defensive stats. And so stat priority can kind of help you gear more towards your preference, and some games allow more control over this than others. As you work further up the pyramid, you're going to have less and less content. That content's going to be harder and harder, and it may restrict how often you can do that content to keep you from pushing through it too quickly, and to help shrink the gap between people that are, let's say, a professional Twitch streamer that can play 60 or 80 hours a week at the absolute top pinnacle level with a group of other players like them, or somebody that maybe this is their very first game and they've only can play an hour a week. Well, to shrink that gap and to make the content last until the next patch, they may set what's called lockouts. How often can you clear that content? The lowest of those lockouts is typically a daily lockout. Usually there's a time of day that's referred to as the reset, where all of those lockouts reset. And so usually that's around 9 or 10 a.m. in the country where the servers are based. So for those of us that play games that have North American based servers, we live here in North America, usually it's sometime throughout the morning. For me, most games living in Central Time in the US, I appreciate all the Texas gamers out there. It's usually 9 or 10 a.m. in most games for me. And so from there, that's my daily reset. That's when things like quests that can be repeated every single day reset. That's when the ability to go into dungeons that limits once per day. And that's when there might be bonuses for clearing a certain type of content for the first time each day reset. All sorts of different kind of mechanics that are meant to encourage you to play a little every day, but not ever feel like you need to play for 12 hours a day. That's when those will reset. Now, because that's still too often for content that's meant to take more than one session to get through, or is meant to take one long session, and we don't expect you to do a long session every single day, there may also be what's called a weekly reset. And a weekly reset traditionally in these games takes place on that Tuesday of the reset. So on 9-10 a.m. on Monday, I'm going to have a reset that's just all the dailies from everything that I completed on Sunday to start Monday, and that'll take place until 9 or 10 a.m. on Tuesday. But on Tuesday, it will not only reset the things that I may have done on Monday that are restricted, but it will also reset all the things that I did anytime since the last Tuesday that they really don't want you doing more than once per week. This is traditionally your bigger group things, because they know not everybody can be in a bigger group thing every night of the week, or they may have designed content like WoW where there's 10 bosses in a raid and you're not meant to be able to clear them all in one sitting. And so you may have to clear those over several organized nights, and that way you have all week to do so. So that's your weekly resets. From there, like you work to the absolute pinnacle, there may start to be more and more luck involved to encourage you to have to do it over and over. And it can be very, very tough to kind of, usually what happens is pretty quickly, it starts to at first just ask for your time, then it asks for your skill, and then it asks for a high level of skill for a high level of time to get to the absolute peak best items, which are referred to as, since you have slots of gear, I have a headpiece, a chest piece, pants, and so on. Each one fits into a slot of gear on my character pane. Those are referred to as best in slot, or BIS, B-I-S. And so that actually allows you to kind of decide, okay, if I want to be better geared, that's what I get. But not everybody wants to focus on gear, or gets to a point where, you know what, that's enough of that type of content. I have the best of the gear that I want for PvP, or maybe I don't want to do PvP at all. I have the best of what I want for PvE, or, you know, my group's working through it and we don't play again together for another couple days. What else do I do? Well, these games also have what are considered side content, optional content off to the side. And sometimes that can feel very lateral, where it's literally adjacent to the primary content and you feel like you need to do both, doesn't matter what order throughout the week. Other times it feels like it's way off in left field. Couldn't matter, get to it whenever you want. Doing a piece of that content that's 5 years old feels every bit as useful as doing the recent stuff, because it's just totally optional. This can be things like a pet system where you get little pets in the game. Maybe those pets can take place in a game. WoW has like literally a Pokemon style battle system that has the creative name of pet battling, and that takes place totally off to the side, doesn't matter at all outside of itself. And there are hundreds and hundreds of pets in these games. You could go collect side mounts. You could go back and grab old gear that's purely can be used to cosmetically change the way your current gear looks. That can usually have its own form of kind of cosmetic, can almost feel like an in-game in itself, chasing these very rare items solely for the way they look. Final Fantasy calls this their glamour system. World of Warcraft talks about how the way you apply the appearance is you transmogrify your existing appearance, so it's got the short name transmog. It's purely cosmetic, and it goes alongside, a lot of times these games have shops where you can go pay real money for cosmetic only items. You can pay for cosmetic only mounts that run at the same speed. They do all the same things as your mounts in most cases, but they just look different. Many times they look like something that would be very cool. It would really stand out. So you can go do that as side content. There can also be side content that does allow you to kind of progress through storylines with maybe factions on the side, and you have to build up reputation with them. There can be all sorts of side content that fills all of those hours you're not playing with other people, either because you don't want to or because it's not the time that you guys agreed to play together. You can also have professions in these games, crafting and gathering professions, where you go out and you harvest raw materials from plants or ore veins or fishing, or you may have crafting where you literally make everything from those cosmetic items to useful items for combat that are either consumed, and it's a constant demand, but they're not that expensive, or they're actually the physical items themselves, and they can be very expensive to make and can take a lot of progression to get the recipe or the ability or the level in your crafting to get there, or they can be very easy and simple, and that can be a progression onto itself, where you're either chasing how much money you can make in these games, which money may or may not have a lot of uses depending on the game, or you're just doing it to do it, or whatever. These games have role play communities where you're literally playing as that character and you're experiencing that. They also have people who just play for the gameplay. They have people who play for the story that's being told. There are so many ways to enjoy these types of games. So I know that when you get started, this is meant to just be a primer, and maybe there's a couple terms in here that you've heard thrown away around that confuse you. This is just meant to be a welcome and an introduction to your first MMO, your first massively multiplayer online, specifically RPG role-playing game. This is Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars, Destiny, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, and so on. The list is very large and is getting larger as we have more of them coming online all the time. It's never ending. I'm mostly talking about games where there's usually some form of either purchasing the game or paying for a subscription monthly or whatever. There's also a whole bunch of ones where you don't pay to get in, but at some point you're going to be asked for money if you want to get past a certain point, like a hard pay wall, or they're going to kind of draw you in by saying you could get that slowly or you could have it now. And so those can feel either where you feel like you have to pay to win, or they can just be pay to play, or they can just be, you know what, paying is totally optional. It's this cosmetic thing, and those can range across the gamut. So I really hope this helped. It was a lot of information. These videos have been very long because I've been tackling what I feel like it feels like a simple question when somebody asks, how do you play an MMO? I just need the quick overview. And I just shot over a bunch of ideas that each on their own could be hundreds of hours of gameplay with hundreds of pieces of tips and tricks, and how does this work, and how do I do it optimally, and what are my options, and are there ways to fail at it, and what's the best way to get to the top. And there are so many ways to do all of this, and it's ever changing in these games that continue to grow and get better and aim for improvement, whether they hit it or not, over not just years, but decades, with a traditionally an expansion cycle being something that games add seasonally or yearly, or in the case of Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft, every other year on alternating years, thank goodness. So I hope this helps. I hope this gives you a little bit of tidbits. If any one of these terms is something that you have a question about, please let me know down below. Please ask it, and I will do my best to answer it. I will be answering it predominantly in Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft terms, because while I played many of these games for some amount of time, varying in range, I have played almost every single expansion that Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft have ever released, and I've played them a lot more hours than the average person. I am not a world first epic perfect in any one of these game modes, but in trade for that, I have probably touched it at least briefly. I play casually across a huge number of ways to play, and I would be happy to get you as far as I can get you and then point you to the resources where I would go if I got to a point where I ran into that wall and I needed that information, and there's somebody who more specifically has the expertise that I'm lacking, because there is such a huge creator community out there, and there's always somebody that is the expert on each individual thing, and it's just an issue of finding them. So thank you guys. Thanks to all of you that have been hitting that subscribe button and the like button and leaving comments. I really appreciate the support. I'm trying to get back to posting at least 5 days a week would be the target. That would be the dream. And then I've been streaming Monday through Friday over on Twitch. And thanks to those of you that have come over and hung out, where I've been mostly playing Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft as we go through a bunch of new patch content in Final Fantasy and a brand new expansion in World of Warcraft, and we get our head wrapped around all the content that has been just added recently to these games, and going back and touching content that maybe I've always wanted to get to and just never quite find the time for, and I'm finally getting a chance. So thank you again. Have a fantastic day, and I will see you all, if not this year, in 2021, where things are bound to be better and amazing. Take care. See you then.